June 4, 1943, Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas. The pencil trembled slightly as Gerfried of Werner Burkhardt wrote in his hidden diary, recording words that would have earned him immediate court-martial and likely execution if discovered by his own officers. "The Americans must be lying to us," he scrawled in the margins of a cigarette packet. No nation could possess such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts. Through the train window, he had just witnessed something that contradicted 3 years of relentless Nazi propaganda about American weakness and decadence. Electric lights blazed from every farmhouse, every street corner, every shop window, an endless constellation of electricity stretching across the Texas plains at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, mandatory blackout regulations had plunged the entire Reich into complete darkness since 1940. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had consistently described as a culturally and economically collapsed America, on the verge of internal collapse, electricity flowed effortlessly like water from a faucet. What made this moment even more shocking for Burkhardt was the historical context he understood. Even before the Second World War began, rural electrification in Germany had reached barely 20% of German farms. The state had repeatedly promised the legendary Volkswagen to the German people since 1934. Yet fewer than 1,000 cars had ever been delivered to ordinary civilians. Meanwhile, this Texas landscape, what should have been an economically devastated nation, according to Nazi radio broadcast, demonstrated electrical abundance that contradicted everything he had been taught to believe. Approximately 1,850 veterans of Rommel's legendary Africa Corps, the same elite desert warriors who had driven the British back across Egypt and earned the grudging professional respect of Field Marshal Montgomery himself, stepped down from the passenger trains in Mexia that June morning. But these were not ordinary prisoners arriving in cattle cars or freight wagons like prisoners had historically been transported. Instead, they disembarked from cushioned Pullman coaches with dining services and private sleeping berths, the same luxury passenger cars used by American civilian travelers. The entire population of Mexia had turned out to witness their arrival, not with hostility, but with curious spectacle. What none of them knew was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological and ideological transformation in modern history. A systematic demolition of Nazi mythology through the overwhelming display of American industrial capacity, agricultural abundance, and democratic prosperity. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle plans or military strategy rooms, but in production statistics that would soon shatter every preconception these soldiers carried about their enemies, their homeland, and the cause for which they had fought. The collapse of their ideological worldview had already begun on May 13, 1943, in the dusty hills of Tunisia. The North Africa surrender, when the dream ended in desert sand. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, replacement commander of Rommel's celebrated Africa Corps, surrendered unconditionally, along with approximately 250,000 to 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The numbers continued to climb as scattered units, cut off and surrounded with no hope of escape or reinforcement, continued surrendering over several days. The Wehrmacht's most experienced and battle-hardened desert fighters' men who had defeated the British in open combat, who had driven mechanized warfare to levels previously unseen in military history, who had earned grudging professional respect even from their enemies, were suddenly prisoners of war. Among them was Oberfeldwebel Friedrich Radke, holder of the Iron Cross First Class, veteran of the triumphant French campaign, wounded twice in the brutal North African fighting. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed and intimate account of the psychological impact of American captivity on German soldiers' minds. His words documented the journey from military defeat to the revelation of a different kind of superiority, not moral or cultural as the Nazis claimed, but purely industrial and organizational. The first shock, American efficiency and abundance. The journey from defeat to ideological revelation began in the Mediterranean port of Oran, Algeria, as Radke and 30,000 other German prisoners waited in makeshift camps for transport ships to take them across the Atlantic. American military efficiency was already beginning to crack their fundamental preconceptions about American capabilities. The United States Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved, even at the absolute height of its power and mobilization. Identity cards were photographed and filed. Medical examinations were completed rapidly and professionally. Inoculations against tropical diseases were administered by trained medical personnel. Geneva Convention rights were explained in fluent German by American officers who had been trained specifically for this prisoner of war management task. But the first truly powerful shock came with the food rations provided to the prisoners. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller, captured with the elite 21st Panzer Division, wrote to his mother 8 months after arriving in America. In the prisoner cage at Oran, while they waited for transport ships, the Americans had fed them better than they had eaten in 6 months of intense desert warfare. White bread made from refined flour. Real coffee, not the chicory substitutes Germans had been drinking. Meat, actual meat served twice every single day. "We thought it was propaganda," Muller wrote in shock. "We believed they were trying to impress us politically. We didn't realize this was their standard military ration for prisoners." This was routine for them. The Liberty ships floating monuments to industrial capacity. The Liberty ships that carried them across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American industrial capacity and organizational genius. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in exactly 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at Kaiser Shipyards in Richmond, California, a fact that would have been instantly dismissed as ridiculous propaganda if the Germans had known it beforehand. These standardized cargo vessels, produced at a peak rate of 3 per day across American shipyards, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Rather than sail back empty across the Atlantic, they carried human cargo up to 30,000 prisoners of war per month during the summer of 1943 alone. By the war's end, American shipyards would produce a staggering 2,710 Liberty ships more merchant vessels than had ever been built to a single design in human history. Each ship required 250,000 component parts assembled from manufacturers located in 32 different American states. The massive Willow Run aircraft plant, which German prisoners would later pass near and witness, was built to construct these ships' equivalents in the aircraft industry. The 2-week Atlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of psychological demolition. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division kept a detailed account that survived in letters to his family after repatriation. The ship's crew, he noted with stunned disbelief, disposed of more food waste each single day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months of desert warfare. American sailors threw away half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of fresh white bread, and gallons of milk that had sat too long. Zimmermann wrote, "They did this openly without any thought, not to mock us, but because to them this waste meant nothing. Their supply was limitless, infinite. The ships themselves became floating classrooms in American power. Prisoners discovered that the vessel carrying them was one of 2,010 Liberty ships that would be built during the entire war. They learned from talkative American guards that the engines of their ship were built in 3 completely separate factories, each producing 900 horsepower cylinders that were then assembled in ports that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stolberg, whose aristocratic Prussian family had served in every German war since Frederick the Great, would later write in his memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched the radar antenna rotating above the bridge. This technology, which we believed only we and perhaps the British possessed in limited quantities, was standard equipment on a cargo vessel. It was then I first suspected that Germany had already lost the war, not just militarily, but fundamentally." August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, and the first evidence of overwhelming power, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. August 2, 1943. The first sight of America shattered the last fragile remnants of Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness. The Norfolk base sprawled across 4,300 acres, its docks stretching for seemingly endless miles, its cargo cranes loading and unloading dozens of merchant ships simultaneously in a continuous operation. In a single day, this one American port handled more tonnage of cargo than the entire German port of Hamburg managed in an entire week of operation. Gefreiter Johann Weber, a factory worker from the Ruhr before his conscription into the Wehrmacht, counted 47 cargo ships in various stages of loading or unloading within his field of vision. Each crane, he noted in his secret diary, lifted loads that would have required a dozen men and horse teams in Germany. They moved with electric power, smoothly, continuously, without the suffocating coal smoke that choked German industrial cities. The prisoners were formed into marching columns for the journey to waiting trains, and along the route they passed parking lots filled with civilian automobiles, hundreds of them belonging to dock workers and laborers. In Germany, private automobile ownership remained an exclusive privilege of the wealthy elite and Nazi Party officials. The Volkswagen, promised to the German people continuously since 1934, remained a propaganda dream with fewer than 1,000 ever delivered to civilians during the entire Nazi era. Here, ordinary manual laborers drove to work in their own cars, some even owning multiple vehicles for different purposes, but nothing prepared them for the trains themselves. The passenger trains, transportation beyond imagination, not box cars, not the infamous 40 and 8 wagons capacity for either 40 men or 8 horses that had carried German troops across all of Europe, but full passenger coaches, Pullman cars with padded seats that converted into comfortable sleeping berths, dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery, observation cars with panoramic windows providing views of the American landscape. Hedman Rodka wrote, "We boarded like tourists, not prisoners. We felt almost ashamed. The American guards seemed almost embarrassed by the comfort. One sergeant actually apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly in our car. Air conditioning in August. We had believed such luxury existed only in Hitler's personal train, if it existed at all. The 3-day train journey from Norfolk to the prisoner camps of Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat possibly could have been. As the trains rolled through Virginia, through the Carolinas, through Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, witnessing an America that couldn't possibly exist according to everything they had been taught. Every small town blazed with illumination. Martinsville, Danville, Greensboro communities that in Germany would have been fortunate to have a single electric street lamp displayed illuminated shop windows, electric signs, and houses with lights burning in multiple rooms simultaneously. The trains passed factories running night shifts, their windows glowing with activity, parking lots completely full even at midnight. Oberfeld-Webel Mayer, whose father was a Nazi party bloc leader in Hamburg, wrote in a letter discovered in 1987, "We passed through dozens of cities that first night. Every single one had more electricity than all of Hamburg combined. The guards told us this was completely normal, that every American town had electricity since the 1920s. I called the guard a liar. He simply shrugged and said we would see." The industrial heartland, witnessing American manufacturing supremacy. In Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped for water and coal. The prisoners watched as American railway workers performed in 30 minutes what would have taken 2 hours in Germany. Automated coal loaders, electric water pumps, mechanized lubrication systems. Every aspect of the operation demonstrated clear technological superiority. More disturbing still was the casual wealth of the railway workers themselves. They wore leather boots that would have cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and threw the empties away without thought. They smoked cigarettes continuously, stubbing them out half-finished. As the trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky, the prisoners encountered American industrial power in full, overwhelming display. Through the windows, they watched endless factories, each one larger than anything most had ever seen in Germany. The Alcoa aluminum plant in Tennessee stretched for 3 miles along the river, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power, more than the entire city of Munich consumed in a full day of operation. Near Louisville, the train slowed as they passed the Rubbertown complex, where synthetic rubber plants had sprung from empty fields in just 18 months. 4 massive facilities, each employing thousands of workers, producing 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. Germany, despite having invented the synthetic rubber process itself, had never managed more than 120,000 tons in its very best year of production. Ford's Willow Run, the apotheosis of American manufacturing. The trains passed Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit, visible from miles away due to its sheer massive scale. This single factory, built in just 9 months, produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. At its maximum capacity, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 individual parts manufactured by whopping 500 different subcontractors scattered across America. The plant consumed 2.5 million square feet of floor space and used more electricity than the entire German city of Cologne. Oberleutnant Verlin, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Tunisia, pressed his face against the window as they passed. He counted 17 B-24 Liberators in various stages of completion visible from the moving train alone. We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, would fall apart in combat, he wrote later, but I could see the precision of the assembly lines, the quality of the construction. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could possibly imagine. The Mississippi River and agricultural abundance. The deeper the trains penetrated into America, the more complete became the destruction of Nazi mythology about American weakness and internal division. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River on the Eads Bridge, while below them barges carried more grain than the entire German harvest of 1942. The prisoners could see grain elevators stretching along both banks of the river, each one holding enough wheat to feed a German city for months. The scale was incomprehensible. Gefreiter Karl Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "The Americans transport food as we transport ammunition in endless quantities without concern for loss or waste. I watched them loading a single barge with enough wheat to feed my entire village for 5 years. The crane operator was eating a sandwich with meat thicker than our weekly ration." In Kansas City, the train stopped at a massive stockyard where tens of thousands of cattle waited for slaughter and processing. The smell of meat-packing plants filled the air for miles. German POWs who had subsisted on 200 grams of meat per week in Africa, when fortunate, watched American workers eating beef sandwiches during their lunch breaks as casually as they might eat bread. "They ate meat like we ate bread," wrote Gefreiter Paul Fischer. "No, that's wrong. They ate meat like we wished we could eat bread. The guard bought us hamburgers from a stand near the station. Meat, cheese, vegetables on white bread for 15 cents. He bought 20 of them without thinking, paid with a single dollar bill. This was not special. This was their normal food." The camps. Luxury beyond comprehension. The arrival at the camps themselves provided the next level of cognitive demolition. Camp Hearn, Texas, built in just 4 months, housed between 3,000 and 4,800 prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians in peacetime Germany. Wooden barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heat systems, each building constructed with more lumber than entire German villages possessed. The camp hospital astounded the medical personnel among the prisoners. Oberst Dr. Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, found himself in a facility better equipped than most German civilian hospitals. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that had been completely unavailable in Germany since 1941, all provided as standard provision for enemy prisoners. They had penicillin, Dr. Bauer would later testify. This miracle drug that we had only heard rumors about. They used it freely, even on prisoners with minor infections. German soldiers were dying for want of basic sulfur drugs, and the Americans were giving us their most advanced medicine without hesitation. The camp kitchen became another classroom in American prosperity. Prisoners assigned to cooking duties discovered walk-in refrigerators, electric mixers, automated dishwashers, and gas ranges capable of preparing meals for 5,000 men. The daily ration included fresh milk, eggs, meat, vegetables, and white bread in quantities that German civilians hadn't seen since 1939. The psychological collapse from fanatic to Democrat. By September 1943, the labor shortage in American agriculture led to the employment of POWs in fields and factories across the country. This decision, driven purely by economic necessity, would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any propaganda program could have achieved. Groups of prisoners were trucked daily to work sites, traveling through the American heartland without blindfolds or restricted routes. They saw everything. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched production lines that processed more tomatoes in a single day than most German factories handled in a month. The facility operated with a skeleton crew of women and elderly men, as most young workers were in the military. Yet production exceeded peacetime levels. Everything was automated electric conveyor belts, automatic filling machines, steam cookers processing hundreds of cans simultaneously. One elderly woman monitored controls that managed what would have required 50 workers in Germany. She did this while listening to a radio and drinking a coffee. By winter 1943, American intelligence officers documented what they called ideological collapse syndrome among the prisoners. The secret re-education program documented increasing numbers of prisoners requesting access to American newspapers, books, and educational materials. The Special Projects Division reported in December 1943, the prisoners no longer argue when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. The most fanatical Nazis have become quiet. They still maintain loyalty to Germany, but no longer speak of victory. Many openly question what they were told about America. Hollywood's psychological warfare. Hollywood films became an unexpected weapon in the re-education arsenal. German prisoners watched Hollywood productions 4 times per week. Films ranging from Gone with the Wind to Walt Disney's animations and Frank Capra's Why We Fight series. These weren't propaganda films designed specifically for the camps. They were American commercial entertainment that revealed a society fundamentally different from what Nazi propaganda had described. German officers watched The Grapes of Wrath and witnessed American criticism of American society, something that would have meant immediate execution in Nazi Germany. They watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and saw Americans criticize their own political system. They watched Disney animations that demonstrated artistic and technical sophistication they hadn't believed Americans possessed. The cultural sophistication and freedom of expression shocked them profoundly. Christmas 1943, Kindness to Enemies. Christmas 1943 provided the most profound psychological impact. American organizations, churches, and civic groups sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German POWs enemies who had been trying to kill American soldiers months earlier. Each package contained cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and games. Local communities invited prisoners to Christmas dinners. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the local Methodist church choir performed Christmas carols in German for the prisoners. Women from Hearn sent in homemade cookies and cakes. The Boy Scouts delivered handmade Christmas cards. This kindness toward enemies shattered the final remnants of Nazi racial theory about American cultural inferiority. Oberleutnant Walter Müller, whose brother had died in the bombing of Hamburg, wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Many have sons and husbands fighting against our armies, yet they show us Christian charity, not propaganda, but genuine kindness. What kind of people treat enemies this way? Only those absolutely certain of victory and secure in their power." The Christmas feast itself defied comprehension. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Quantities of food that Germany hadn't seen since before the First World War. The prisoners ate until they were sick, unable to comprehend such resources being lavished on enemies. "We ate like kings," wrote one prisoner, "better than German generals eat, better than party leaders." And this was not special. The guards told us this was a normal American Christmas dinner, that every American family was eating the same meal. If they can feed prisoners this way, what must their own soldiers eat? D-Day, the final revelation, June 6, 1944. When news of the Normandy invasion reached the camps, German prisoners experienced their final ideological collapse. Over 7,000 naval vessels, including 4,000 landing craft and approximately 12,000 aircraft supporting the invasion. Nearly 160,000 troops landed on D-Day alone, with 23,400 airborne troops jumping from 822 aircraft and gliders. Within weeks, 850,000 Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, with 70,000 tons of supplies and 150,000 vehicles. The scale demonstrated American organizational capacity beyond Nazi Germany's wildest dreams. Prisoners watched newsreels of the invasion within days. They saw endless streams of ships, the artificial harbors, the supply system delivering 15,000 tons daily across open beaches. They watched their homeland being crushed by the very nation they had been told was too weak to fight a two-front war. "We knew then that everything was lost," wrote one officer, "not just the war, but the entire Nazi project. We had challenged the world's greatest industrial power with fairy tales and racial mythology. We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their automatic weapons, courage against their unlimited resources." The transformation. Former Nazis become democracy's ambassadors. By March 1945, the re-education program had produced remarkable results. Over 25,000 prisoners had voluntarily enrolled in democracy courses. The camp newspapers published articles about constitutional government, free markets, and civil rights. Discussion groups debated Germany's future after the war. Prisoners who had arrived as fanatical Nazis were writing essays about democratic reconstruction. Officers who had sworn personal oaths to Hitler were planning how to implement American agricultural methods in post-war Germany. "We became missionaries for democracy," admitted one former Nazi officer in a 1975 interview. "Not through coercion or propaganda, but through observation. We saw it work. We saw ordinary people living better than German aristocracy. We wanted that for Germany." The statistics of transformation. The magnitude of the German POW experience in America can be measured in statistics that reveal both the scale of the operation and its remarkable success. The camps. Over 500 camps across 45 states, with 175 main camps and 325 branch camps housing from 250 to 12,000 prisoners each. The prisoners, 371,683 German POWs, part of 425,171 total Axis prisoners. Peak population reached in May 1945. An average of 20,000 new arrivals monthly in 1943, 30,000 monthly after D-Day, and 60,000 monthly in the final months of war. The escape attempts. Only 2,222 escape attempts from over 371,000 prisoners, 0.6%. 0 successful permanent escapes. Most escapees were recaptured within 24 hours. No American civilians were harmed by escaped POWs. The educational impact. Over 40,000 enrolled in educational courses. 135 camp newspapers were published. 30,000 took English classes. 15,000 received vocational training. University correspondence courses were provided to 8,000 prisoners. The post-war impact. Approximately 5,000 former POWs immigrated to the United States after the war. Over 12,000 maintained correspondence with American families for an average of 31 years. Post-war surveys showed that 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. An astounding 74% believed captivity had positively changed their worldview. Building the German miracle, POWs become architects of Reconstruction between 1945 and 1946. 371,283 German POWs were repatriated from American camps. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. But they brought with them something precious knowledge of how a democratic industrial society functioned. The German POWs who experienced American prosperity became unwitting agents of transformation in post-war Germany. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at Camp Kearney, became president of the European Commission. Rudiger von der Marwitz, held at Camp Hearn, served as German permanent representative to the United Nations. Edward Ackerman, prisoner at Fort Robinson, became a leader in German agricultural reform. They brought American methods to German industry, American efficiency to German agriculture, and American democratic ideals to German politics. The economic miracle of the 1950s was built partly on knowledge gained in American prison camps. We learned that prosperity came from freedom, not conquest, Hans Kroll wrote in his memoirs. We saw that democracy created wealth, that diversity brought strength, that treating workers well increased production. These lessons learned as prisoners shaped the new Germany. The ultimate victory? Conversion through prosperity. In the end, America's greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not, the complete transformation of enemy minds. The German POWs had arrived, believing in German superiority and American weakness. They left knowing the truth. American industrial might was not just overwhelming. It was incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity and totalitarian control. The trains that had brought them into captivity in 1943 had carried warriors of the Third Reich. The ships that returned them to Germany in 1946 carried architects of democracy. They had seen the future, and it worked. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not military might, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's capacity to create abundance. In their transformation lay the seeds of Europe's post-war redemption and the final defeat of the Nazi dream. They returned to Germany not as defeated enemies, but as witnesses to what free societies could achieve. The German POWs had arrived in America expecting to find a weak, divided nation on the verge of collapse. Instead, they discovered an industrial colossus of unlimited power and surprising humanity. They came as prisoners of war, but left as witnesses to the arsenal of democracy at its absolute peak. Their story stands as testament to a profound truth. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not through destruction, but through demonstration, not through propaganda, but through prosperity, not through hatred, but through humanity.